In the Texas town where I grew up, a large irrigation canal served the dual purpose of providing water to the surrounding rice fields and dividing the black and white communities. Black homes, black schools, black grocery stores, black businesses, black churches, and black gas stations all clustered on the canal's north side, while white homes and schools and businesses and churches spread out from the south side. In those few areas where the races were forced to cross, the same spirit of division symbolized by the canal prevailed. Public and government buildings provided black and white restrooms and drinking fountains and even separate benches to sit on. In my family doctor's office, one waiting room was labeled white and the other colored. And the town hospital took care to separate patients into spacious white wings and cramped colored wings. The parks and swimming beaches always reserved a small, unattractive area far down one side for colored only. During the summer of 1964, a bridge was constructed across the canal to enable black students to cross into the white area and board buses transporting them to white schools for the first time. Much anguish and outrage had preceded the building of the bridge, but the community ultimately chose to comply with civil rights laws. I remember the lone black student in my homeroom as we began our first integrated school year. How frightened he looked, as though he was trying to hide under his desk as he shrank down. I remember studying all the black students in the hallways and noticing their different styles of dressing and speaking and carrying themselves, and wondering if we had anything in common at all. Integration was accomplished mostly peaceably, despite everyone's fears of violence. Yet in many ways it seemed as though it had not really happened, since black people didn't really come very far into white strongholds. Though all shared a school, the old line of division still existed in the classrooms and hallways and cafeteria and football stadium, as black folks clustered always in one small area, sitting and standing together, always on the far end of something, while white folks spread out across the rest of the space. All those white and colored signs were taken down, but they remained in our collective imagination, encouraging people to segregate themselves again and again on opposite sides of common areas. The bridge had been built in the exterior world only, not in the hearts of the people affected by it. And to this day, that bitter reality that I saw enacted in my hometown still plays out. namely that the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are two very different matters. People may comply with decrees, will do all the prescribed things, but no legislation can instill them with feelings of generosity and fair-mindedness. Behavior and attitudes do not always coincide, no matter how insistent the voices of authority that call for that coinciding may be, which is a truth that authorities of all kinds have known always. This month, our worship services reflect on the theme of authority, a subject that our spiritual tradition is alternately clear in understanding and confused in understanding. We insist that ultimate authority in determining meaning and values rests with each individual person. But just what criteria does each of us use to measure meaning? And how do I know which of all the ideas and words that circulate through my consciousness are ones that I should take seriously? When and why should I take something you say as authoritative? And what if you're contradicting something I regard as authoritative? Given that so much of our usual ways of being authoritative are rooted in white supremacist culture, a culture we've committed ourselves to dismantling, what does that dismantling mean about some of our long-beloved authorities? When whiteness is decentered, does that mean the authority it holds is no longer authoritative? While we sometimes describe ourselves as spiritual liberals, as people who are willing to stand in ambiguity and live into questions without having immediate answers, I wonder, while we're in the middle of that ambiguity and those questions, what then does authority look like? Who has it? And what in God's name are they doing with it? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose memory we mark this weekend, drew upon that image to encourage patience in those who worked with him to bring justice and equity into relationships and fairness to those excluded from so many basic human freedoms. Understanding well that patterns of behavior which had been in place for centuries would not change overnight, and understanding well that any of us quickly gets discouraged when we do not get what we wanted when we wanted it, King decided to be up front and skip any happy reassurances of reaching the goal in the next week. The road is long and winding. The arc of change is long, and King intended that his partners in the struggle grasp that reality. But that was not a reason to give up, to lose hope, because the arc will ultimately bend towards justice, King insisted, with the full authority he held as a minister, as a leader, as someone who spent every moment in the midst of struggling to bend that arc. And that however long and winding the road, it would absolutely one day culminate in the freedom being sought and dreamed of and died for. Beautiful words, an inspiring image, the promise that justice comes in time. But how many of us are able to hang in there? To keep showing up to work for justice when we see nothing happening, when our political leaders choose polarizing rhetoric and heavy doses of blame over actual decisions, when legislation turns towards less freedom, less justice, when nobody shows up for rallies and petitions are ignored and volunteers cannot be found, and week after month after year passes and nothing changes except we're all a little older, a little more tired, and a little more cynical. Who can see the arc bending then? and with that bend, keep going another day. Is it possible that King ultimately is not the authority we once believed? He did gain a great deal of the authority he holds after he died. For in his final chapter of his life, King was hated on all sides, including among those who had previously followed him. He was criticized by racial bigots and some leaders who held the goals he did but wanted to use very different methods. King was assassinated, time passed, the eloquence of his words and the courage of his actions were shared and reshared, and his authority as someone we heed and want to follow grew. But along with the progress we have seen in building up racial justice, we've also seen retrenchment, hatred, second-guessing of King's work. Just as King experienced in his lifetime, too many churches, including churches claiming to be progressive and justice-seeking, then and now show up as bastions of racism rather than being places where racism is being dismantled. So how do we understand what authority King holds for us in the present or in the future? Or does he more and more become a once celebrated, long ago, no longer reliable source of authority? What may make King's voice still a voice we listen to, what gives it continued authority, may come from his repeated talk about the suffering that spiritual growth, specifically the growth involved in racial justice work and in our own learning to be anti-racists, will bring. Unlike some authorities who love to talk endlessly of happy things and peace and happiness, King never glossed over the real pain he and those he led endured, had endured for centuries, and would continue surely to endure even while progress was being made. He emphasized that the longed-for day of freedom and equality was well off in the future, not around the next corner, and the path to that longed-for day would absolutely be hard, really hard, so hard that at times it would seem impossible to take another step. And yet, with all the talk of suffering, King kept linking it to growth and meaning in every image he lifted up. The suffering was not just random badness that life brings to everyone, not just evil to fight against, but the suffering held embedded within it the seeds of transformation, which meant there would be no sidestepping it. The only way out had to be through. And by willingly facing suffering, King taught us the freedom being sought would be reached, no matter how impossible it might seem. We will hew out of this mountain of despair a stone of hope, he said. The despair could not be avoided, but must be taken up and worked with, and even then, the results would seem so small, just a stone. But that small stone was a stone of hope. And bit by bit, those stones could amount to something large, real. Quite a different message than what often seems to pass for spiritual teaching, both in some traditional paths and some newer paths. Suffering is often interpreted as a payment for mistakes, or as some kind of mental construct that is not real, something to be gotten past as quickly as possible, and something which, when one is sufficiently spiritually mature, will disappear entirely. That, of course, is a message that sells quite well. Who among us would not sign up for a life devoid of pain and loss and aggravation and death? And yet if I do sign up for it, what do I do about that voice in me which keeps noting all the pain and loss and aggravation and death that is all around all the time? Perhaps the only way to respond to that objection is to opt for a spiritual perspective that does not deny suffering, nor promise me a magic way around it, but as King preached and taught, acknowledges its reality and its possibilities. I don't minimize my suffering in any way, but I am challenged to take it up, figure it out, trust that some meaning will emerge from it, and keep hewing away at it until it begins to resemble not just despair, but hope, a first stone of hope. The work of changing an entire society is incredibly hard and incredibly slow. The powers and principalities that have been in place since the beginning of time will not simply yield, no matter how loud our voices, no matter how inspiring our rhetoric, no matter how justified our cause. That arc King saw is very, very long. While it does ultimately bend towards justice, if we're standing somewhere in the middle of that arc, we probably can't see that bend much of the time, maybe never. So we need something to keep us working other than quick results. And perhaps we can find that in seeing the work we do for justice as a two-way street. We may start out trying to bend the arc on behalf of others, but that work of bending the arc also makes a difference in us. Not the simplistic difference of feeling good because we just did something good, but the difference that transforms us along with transforming the larger society. King reminded us that we live in an inescapable network of mutuality, so the work never goes just one way. The changes are never made all for just people out there somewhere. The work comes back around to each one of us, changing us, becoming our soul work. So many events in this country in the last few years have reminded us, not that we needed any reminding, how far we have yet to go to reach the other end of that arc, where it begins to touch down into justice. Celebrations of King's Holiday this weekend will mark how far along we've come on that arc, the ways in which justice has been brought more fully into our lives. One of the beauties of King's image is that an arc never flattens out or breaks off or heads back in the direction from which it began. The arc is always bending, bit by bit, even when we can't see that bend for long stretches of time. The arc is not rigid. It does not plateau. It bends second by second by second. And we're called to keep moving along that arc, giving our support to it and realizing that it continues to bend towards justice even when our own efforts don't seem to be accomplishing that end. The road we travel is long, with many a winding turn. Chances are we won't get to where we hope to go in our lifetime. But that's no reason to just quit. This morning, if you've grown tired and maybe had to let go of the arc, try to lift up your hands and grasp it once more. Let the arc carry you for a while if you don't feel you have the strength just now to be one of those who carries it. Try not to despair when the arc seems not to be moving, because that's an illusion. It always moves. At every moment, In our wonderful, vast, incomprehensible network of mutuality, we are all moving all together, all of us supporting one another and supporting that beautiful arc that carries us always towards the beloved community. May it be so. Amen.